super friends, my name is Neil and welcome to this episode 108 of the Get Your Comic Con podcast. We're here fortnightly-ish to bring you a slice of film, TV and pop culture goodness from our studio direct to your listening or watching device. Happy New Year! This is our first podcast of 2024. We somewhat accidentally ended up taking the entire of December off, but a mental health break is a mental health break nonetheless. But we are back with a very exciting first episode for the brand new year. I hope everyone had a good break over the holidays. I hope you're all well rested. I hope you got some good presents. And yeah, it's time to get back to work, I think, unfortunately. So this episode we are doing a deep dive into the first of Warner Brothers and DC's three-part Crisis on Infinite Earths animated movie. Part 1 is available already on digital platforms here in the UK and globally, and comes to 4K Blu-ray Steelbook on January the 29th, 2024. Part 2 is coming very, very soon, though I can't tell you when, and Part 3 will be with us probably sooner than you think it will be. So we are going to talk a little bit about the comic book, we're going to talk a bit about the film, and we are also going to be joined by three very special guests this episode. You may have heard them on this podcast before. It is always a pleasure to talk to the creative teams behind these movies. But we are going to be joined by director Jeff Wamester, who has worked on nearly every single one of the Tomorrowverse movies from Justice Society World War II right through to this Crisis three-part storyline. We're going to be joined by producer and writer of this film, Jim Krieg, as well as longtime DC producer Butch Lukic. I sat down with them recently for a chat about how they crafted the Tomorrowverse and how they brought Crisis from such a legendary 12-part comic book to the screen. But I figure before we get down to that, it's probably worth going over some of the history of Crisis on Infinite Earths and Crisis in general and what that means to a DC fan. So, in case you are not already clued in, it is time for a history lesson. So Crisis on Infinite Earths was a 12-part story which was written by Marv Wolfman and illustrated by the late great George Perez. It came about at a time when DC and comic books in general were really starting to put focus into the idea of continuity. When comic books were first created, when Superman, when Batman, Wonder Woman, all of these characters were first invented, the idea of continuity was a lot less prevalent than we would find in comic books now. So as writers would come and go, or artists would come and go, there would be changes that would just invariably happen to fit with the story that that creative team was wanting to work on. So, you know, certain aspects would always remain the same. Superman would always come from Krypton as a baby. Batman's parents were always murdered in Crime Alley. But certain things would change. So sometimes Batman would be a scientist. Sometimes he's a millionaire. Things like that would change. Or they would introduce a character like, for instance, Batwoman, where you had the kind of the Catty Kane type version of the character. Then you would have a Batgirl introduced. Then someone would decide that maybe the origin of one of them wasn't quite right, so they would invent a new version of that character. And so continuity, whilst not a mess or something that was really being so heavily focused on, was something that comic book companies realised was a potential issue moving down the line. The longer that the popularity of these stories would be maintained, they would need to have a better sense of storytelling broadly, because it's like almost if you look at a show like The Simpsons where no one has aged, that can only work so well, particularly in a comic book format. So it was decided that they needed to tighten up their continuity, maybe trim some of the strange, weird and wonderful changes that had happened, and bring everything into more of a unified view moving forwards. And so Marv Wolfman began this storyline, Crisis on Infinite Earths, which would see the entire of DC crumbling from its kind of slightly messy structure into this multiverse that was in danger from a villain known as the Monitor. Obviously, if you have watched Crisis on Infinite Earths, the 5-part crossover from CW's Arrowverse, you will be somewhat familiar with the concept as well. And so what Crisis did was, through this huge storyline which melded all the different versions of characters together, and it introduced this concept that there could be multiple different Earths. We're about to be joined by a fourth guest. Oliver is lurking. It took the idea that when we'd seen these weird twists and changes that different creative teams had created, that they were in fact different versions of these characters from different Earths. And so that instantly invented the idea of the multiverse. And what DC then did was use the threat of the Monitor and his antimatter wave to move certain pieces around and create an Earth with the parts of characters that they wanted to use, take others and put them on other Earths that they could revisit later if they wanted to, or introduce the concept that other alternate ideas could then be used on alternate Earths that wouldn't impact the main continuity. And it gave you your main through line continuity moving forwards and just cut some of the things that they didn't want to have anymore. And so, yes, characters were killed off. Huntress had previously been invented as a Helena Wayne version of the character, who was the daughter of Batman and Catwoman. She was written out during Crisis and was replaced by what we now know as the Helena Bertinelli version of the character that exists in main continuity, or does she if you're reading the Justice Society comic book. And so that was the broad strokes version of what they used it for. It was to neaten things up and to allow them to take more control over their narratives moving forwards. But it also offers up this huge opportunity, which we now know as Elseworlds, which is where stories like Gotham by Gaslight can come in, whereby you can come up with this crazy concept for a character that we already know, and rather than have it impact on your main continuity or do something weird that interrupts the narrative flow of what's happening in the main DCU, you can do it, you can plop it onto a different Earth, and it kind of has its own place. It exists in its own place within the DC multiverse. So that was the idea of Crisis. Now, obviously, there have been many, many more crises since then. 9 of them, I think, judging up to the latest one. So we've had things like Identity Crisis, Heroes in Crisis. The most recent one was Dark Crisis on Infinite Earths, which was Joshua Williamson's big storyline a couple of years ago. And so DC crises are often used as these huge multiverse ending events that are used to help shift things around in the DCU a little bit when they need to switch things up. And so it's become a really wonderful narrative. I don't want to say crutch because that makes it sound like it's when there's a weakness. When you need to make a big change, a crisis is a great way to do that. And so here we are. We are now at a point where obviously the DC animated universe came to an end with Justice League Dark Apocalypse War back in 2018. And the Tomorrowverse was invented. We got introduced to Darren Criss's Superman in Superman Man of Tomorrow. We've been introduced to Jensen Ackles' Batman, Stan Akatic's Wonder Woman, Matt Bomer's Flash. Throughout this series of movies that have led up to this point. The most recent one was Justice League Warworld, which was released back in July, believe it or not, from San Diego Comic-Con. And that was where we were introduced to this idea that maybe Warworld was going to be the threat, and at the end of it, it was revealed that there was a crisis coming. And that's where we are now, with Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 1, which is available, as I said at the top of this podcast, digitally now, and comes to Blu-ray, 4K Blu-ray Steelbook on January the 29th. So I want to segue into the animated movie. And before we sit down for our interview with the creators, I think it's worth just talking a bit about the cast and the setup for this movie. So I just named a bunch of them there. So you have Matt Bomer as the Flash, Jensen Ackles Batman, Darren Criss Superman, Meg Donnelly Supergirl, Stan Akatic Wonder Woman, Jimmy Simpson is back as Green Arrow, Zachary Quinto is back as Lex Luthor, Jonathan Adams is voicing the Monitor, Ike Amadi as John Jones, Jeffrey Arend as Psycho Pirate, Zach Callison as Dick Grayson, who's being introduced for the first time in this film, Alexandra Daddario is back as Lois Lane, Alistair Duncan as Alfred, Atto Esando as Mr. Terrific, Cynthia Hamidi as Dawnstar, Aldous Hodge as John Stewart, Erica Ishii as Dr. Light, David Kay as The Question. I'm reading this from IMDb as I'm talking to you, and I do not want to miss Iris West because she's such an integral part of this movie. So you also, where is she? David Kay as The Question, Ashley Lathrop as Iris West, Matt Lanter as Blue Beetle, Liam McIntyre as Aquaman, Nolan North as Hal Jordan, he's also voicing Amazo, Lou Diamond Phillips as the Spectre, Keisha Sharp as Vixen, and Harry Shum Jr. is also back as Brainiac 5. So if you have been a fan of the Tomorrowverse movies, all of those names will pretty much ring a bell to you. It has now been revealed that Jim Krieg, Butch Lukic, and to a degree Jeff, who has been directing for several of these movies, have done, along with the writers across these films. So the wonderful Tim Sheridan, who we interviewed back for Superman, Man of Tomorrow, Jeremy Adams, who has written a number of these movies as well. What they have done, they have genuinely crafted I believe it's 7, let's do it, Superman, Man of Tomorrow, Batman Long Halloween Part 1, Part 2, Green Lantern Beware My Power, this is not in order, Justice Society, World War II, Legion of Superheroes, and Justice League Warworld. So the 7 movies up to this point, this is the 8th now, have built an arc perfectly towards Crisis. We have been introduced to certain characters along the way that are important to the Crisis storyline. We've also been introduced to certain aspects that are important to the Crisis storyline, which we didn't realise it at the time, but all of it has been building from that introduction of Superman, Man of Tomorrow, right through to this point. So, like Supergirl, you had the future time travel in there. You had the ideas around her abilities and Brainiac and all of those characters. You have the Flash introduced in Justice Society World War II, and that's not just a simple Flash story. That's obviously a Flash story where he runs to another Earth. So that introduces the idea of the multiverse and multiple dimensions. And in Justice League Warworld, you're introduced to what could be multiple versions of the Trinity as well. So Wonder Woman not recognizing that Superman as her Superman being someone slightly older, who you do get introduced to in the movie, which we will get down to in a minute. All of the different aspects of storyline which are important to Crisis, all of those different elements have been introduced across those 7 movies to the point that would prepare us for this 3-part storyline, which I think is absolutely fantastic. And I did have to remark during my interview that I didn't see it coming, which is ridiculous. I say ridiculous. It's ridiculous, but it's very exciting because as a DC fan who, looking by the shelves behind me, I read a lot of DC. I live a lot of DC. It's in my artwork. It's on my shelves. There's action figures there. When I'm surprised because I don't know the direction of travel of a storyline, then I am very, very happy. So it was cool that this came as a surprise to me. And I think that's probably a good place to stop and let the creators tell us about this. So I sat down with, as I said, director Jeff Wamester, who has worked on several of these movies, Jim Krieg, who's produced everything up to this point and has written Crisis on Infinite Earths, and Butch Lukic, who has been a producer on all of these movies as well. We've all talked at different points about this universe before. I only met Jim for the first time at San Diego Comic-Con last year, so this was only the second time we've spoken. And there was so much I wanted to talk to them about. I had loads of questions written down where I was going to ask about certain characters, certain things which could be considered spoilery, which we will get to once we get to the review of the film, which I will kind of dive into after this interview. There were lots of aspects of kind of what storyline threads did you want to pull from the book, what things did you need to change, that I really wanted to talk about. But what I kind of realised going into this is I've only seen chapter 1 of a 3-part story. So whilst there are aspects of the book which are absent from this first film, that is not to say that they're not going to come in chapter 2 or chapter 3. So I kind of felt like I didn't want to go down a line of questioning that might end up being completely pointless when it comes to films that we're about to get in the next few months. And hopefully I will get to chat to these guys again and dive a little bit deeper into some of those aspects later on once we have a fuller idea about what it is they're actually doing. So I decided that what we would do with this interview is talk about bringing Crisis to the screen, celebrating the Tomorrowverse, creating the Tomorrowverse, crafting this 8-film storyline so far, what will be a kind of 10, 11 storyline film by the time universe by the time it's done. And so I very much wanted to talk to them about that. I wanted to celebrate the fact that Jeff has worked on so many of these films and that Justice Society World War II was his first time directing with DC. So this is an interview where we laugh quite a lot. I apologise. We very much talk about crafting Crisis, bringing Crisis to the screen, and what that means and how that works. So sit down for the next 10 minutes and enjoy me having a blast with some people that I feel very blessed to have interviewed several times over the last few years. Thanks very much. Hi, guys. It's a pleasure to see you all again. How are you doing?
Oh, good. You?
Great. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, good. Thank you. It's been a while. I think it was San Diego Comic-Con the last time I saw you when we were all in a room for Warworld. So first of all,
those rooms are hard. Those rooms are so hard.
Yeah,
that's the Crisis. That is the real.
Yeah,
that's the real Crisis, right?
That is like
Jeff passed out there.
So congratulations! This is a storyline that I've wanted to see you guys do for a while, and I was so excited, particularly the fact that this is 3 parts and it's this big epic story, and I absolutely loved part 1. Jim
that
and Butch,
is the right answer. This guy's our favorite guy. Keep talking. Say more.
Okay. Yeah. Now I wanted to come to you first, Jim and Butch, just to kind of talk about how you mapped out the journey for for the Tomorrowverse, kind of from Man of Tomorrow up to this point? How did you? Can you talk me a little bit through laying out the plan for building towards Crisis?
Yeah, I mean, originally we knew we had to lay out 5 or 6, 7 movies beforehand, and we just had titles for like a few of them. Long Halloween, we didn't. We obviously knew what the story was going to be. Man of Tomorrow, we kind of didn't. And then beyond that, Justice Society, we knew we had to get to World War II and Earth 2. But as far as where we went with that, to Crisis, it didn't really come about until we were working out the scripts and the story. And then it's like, okay, wedge this character in. We can later bring them into Crisis and wedge this character. So it was all done by not originally we had it fully worked out. It's like as we went along, because Jim was constantly going, I don't know how we're gonna get to Crisis. And then all of a sudden he had a bright idea like Stan Lee, you know.
Yeah, I'm just like Stanley standing on the desk,
I
acting
don't
it
get
out.
this crap.
That's
Hey,
what,
wait a minute.
that's what
What about
Jeff
this
waits
character?
for. He was like, Jim, can you stand up on the desk and act it out?
Yeah.
I mean, we did know that it was going to be Crisis, and so pouring through those issues and seeing what characters were absolutely vital
Yeah.
gave us a roadmap of who we needed to establish in this reality. And amusingly, when we started, the world was so different that we felt like we needed an entire movie, and that was the Justice Society movie to establish what a parallel Earth is. And by the time we were actually making this movie, there were everything was a multiverse, and we felt like we were introducing the word. So it's like Earth 2 is another Earth where that's just like ours, but different things happened. And by the time it was out, it was like every movie was a multiverse already. But because it takes just that long. But yeah, so we knew the scenes we wanted and the big epic moments that people remember from Crisis on Infinite Earths. And knowing what characters were needed, we reverse engineered back to who should be in what movie and how we could, hopefully make people fall in love with them. So when they're brutally killed, they'll feel bad.
It
Right.
worked. Yeah,
for
I
us.
totally. When when the wave is coming towards Earth, I'm on the edge of my seat, and I'm anxious for these characters, even though we've only spent 7, 8 movies with them up to this point. And Jeff, coming to you, I mean, the first time you and I spoke for Justice Society World War II, we were talking about the fact that this was the first time you were directing one of these DC projects. So how does that feel for you now? I mean, not only have you brought this crisis level event to the screen, but you've also been involved so intrinsically with the whole arc up to this point. How does that feel as a director?
I didn't know the complete plan of what these guys were doing.
We didn't know the plan either, so I couldn't touch it.
So
don't tell them that.
It's true though. I mean, Jeff kept asking, "What's going on here, and where's this character going?" I'm like, just wait, we'll figure it out.
Yeah, don't worry.
That was good. That was good for Jeff. It kept him kind of going on a course that helped him be more spontaneous with some of the storytelling.
But you're right. This has been a whole journey for Jeff to go from first-time director to exhausted veteran.
The space of what?
What are you talking about? 3 movies in a row of Crisis? I wasn't exhausted at all.
It's like this starts with you as the new recruit in Vietnam, like, "Hi guys, how's Vietnam?" And then it just ends and like
after tour number 10, I'm like, "I'm fine, guys."
You don't even say hello to the new recruits. They're going to the meat grinder.
It was fun because it forced me to also take one movie at a time. So it wasn't like oh my God, I need to do this or I need to do that. As Butch was saying, like a little more spontaneous, and I wasn't trying to keep myself too penned in, in that process. So it was to kind of work with Butch, who would kind of pull me in on the guardrails, on it. Like, oh, we can't quite go that way or this way. It put me in a good spot to be really creative with some of the answers that we had to come up with or challenges that came up as we went along, and then kind of see all of that process come to an end like this, where it culminates in this big series of movies, and knowing like, oh no, we need to do this or that with this character, or like here's the consequences. I was able to, I think, be a little more attached to each one and see where I wanted to do when we got to that crisis. Actually have a little more spontaneous reaction to like, oh no, we should kind of push here or push that or up the drama on this part to make this character feel, and then also be like, oh, let's look at some of the original material and how they died, and like maybe we can play with that spot shot, or maybe we can make something work where we can really add to that. Because what George Perez did with a lot of those shots, where you're like, oh, that's, oh my god, it's so tragically, and we're all so attached to it. It was it made it a little more visceral in the process when we got to Crisis, which I think comes across on the screen.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I
Yeah.
mean, you've got not only the huge ensemble cast, but visually there's so many more characters on the screen and so many more elements than we kind of have seen in some of the previous movies, all happening at the same time. So again, kind of just sticking with directing for a second, how did that differ from some of the previous ones, or did it differ, or is it just another day at the office at this point?
Well, I mean, part of it is the same. I mean, yeah, but also like we're trying to honor kind of like a lot what they did in the movies as much as we could in terms of like, how people died and how things happened and progressed in terms of like that sense of consequence throughout it. But it also there was a lot of energy that I had during it because when I grew up on it, so it was pretty exciting to do.
Jeff is one of the few people who would come into the office, and when we were during the middle of COVID, it was like working in the Overlook Hotel from The Shining. It was, there was room for 700 people, but it was basically Jeff and I and a couple people on the other side of the building.
Yeah.
So if it was, you're getting really stir crazy, I'd go in and check on what he was doing. And the takeaway is this didn't get easier. It wasn't like, oh, now I'm got it. It's because each movie ended up having another challenge. And then once you were in Crisis, there were so many characters, but I would go in and visit Jeff and he would show me the animatic and I'd be like, ooh, that's a lot of people. Oh, I guess I did say that, didn't I? Because it's one thing to say these 7 characters are at the tuning fork, and it's another thing to draw them over and over again. So sorry.
Well, Jeff didn't have all the complete models of a lot of these characters. So basically going through the storyboard and the animatic, a lot of these the elements weren't even complete yet. So unfortunately, that is how animation is. I know artists love to complain about it, board guys especially. We never get models. It's like, well, that's how it's always been. I've been doing this for 33 years. I never had models on BTAS. They always came after you finishing the fucking board.
There's also so many characters and they have so many powers that I remember like Jeff is like saying, well, this is a hard fight because, she can fly. And I'm thinking, she can fly? It's like, oh, right. Oh.
There is a lot of that Jeff had to go through as far as we had to find out from DC themselves what some of these characters we just really weren't familiar with. So what are their powers and what do they do and they don't do? Even if they were in the background, we still needed them somewhere else eventually.
They also change. Amazing Man has several different versions of what his powers are. So we just picked the one that was most useful for the movie.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, that is it for my time.
You stuck with the 80s.
Thank you so much for taking the time.
No, you got to say more nice things about it. You're the one.
Well, look, I could say so much. There are so many things I want to say, but I don't want to get into spoiler territory for part 2 or part 3. And so I just thought, let's talk about bringing Crisis to the screen, and hopefully we'll get to chat again about parts 2 and parts 3, and we can dive in a little deeper on some of the big spoilery moments. And I will, of course, heap praise on you because it will be brilliant. I'm sure it will.
I'm supposed to say the trailer drops tomorrow.
Yes, I've just seen the tease for the teaser, so I'm looking forward to seeing what's to come from that tomorrow. But thank you so much, guys. It's a pleasure as always. I'll see you again next time.
Thank you so much.
And a massive thank you again to Jeff, to Jim, and to Butch for sitting down to chat with me. I really, really hope, just as a fan of these films, that the way that parts 2 and 3 will line up is that I will get to talk to them maybe in person at San Diego Comic-Con to celebrate the Tomorrowverse and the end of this trilogy, because it would be amazing to be able to do that. Obviously, you've seen me do that at the last couple of Comic-Cons, and it would just be really wonderful for me as a fan and my fan journey and my kind of fan journalist journey with these films to be able to do that. So let's now give you some of my thoughts on the film. There will be some minor spoilers, so if you've not seen the film yet, you might want to pause right now, go watch it and come back later on. If you are not scared of spoilers, then let's go. Let's dive in. You can also read my review over on our website, which, if you haven't been, is www.getyourcomiccon.co.uk. So I absolutely adored Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 1, and I am not ashamed to say it. This is a storyline which I have been hoping for some time that they would tackle, and as you've just heard me say in the interview there. It's something that I feel like this creative team, Butch and Jim, who have been working on these movies for years now, deserved the chance to be able to tackle it. The elephant in the room is obviously that a lot of people will presume that this is happening because of DC Studios. That isn't necessarily the case. I think it's somewhat just timing that this has happened. There was probably an awareness that there would be some kind of studio change coming with Discovery coming on board, buying Warner Brothers. And so it feels like it was the right time for this to happen, regardless of whether it is because of what's coming or not. And there's no need to waste any more time or breath on that, because it is what it is. This is a wonderful arc, which, as we've been talking about, starts with Man of Tomorrow and builds up to this point. So what I really appreciated with Crisis on Infinite Earths is the fact that they have not tried to bend the characters from the Tomorrowverse who have been introduced and make them fit the story of Crisis. What they have instead done is take the story of Crisis on Infinite Earths. They've taken Marv Wolfman's words and George Perez's wonderful, wonderful illustrations, and they have bent that story to fit around the Tomorrowverse. So some character roles have changed. In this first part, there are certain aspects of the comic book which do not appear. So if you're very familiar with the comic, you'll know that it starts out on Earth 3 with the Crime Syndicate, which is where this film also has a lot of its first act. But as that storyline comes to an end in the comic, Alexander Luthor Jr. is sent across the multiverse and is an integral part of the ongoing Path Crisis. And Alexander Luthor does not appear in this film. So there are some major changes, but they are not necessarily to save time or any of that. It's all about making Crisis on Infinite Earths a story about the Tomorrowverse, and that is why Matt Bomer's Flash is right in the center of everything. His relationship with Ashley Lothrop's Iris is really key to this film and adds a wonderful human element to it, which is really gorgeous as it plays out on screen, and really heartbreaking as well, and it adds a different dynamic. In the comic book, I mean, obviously they're similar mediums in that it's, we're not talking about live action here, but there's still kind of budget and production time scales which need to be thought about when you're working on an animated movie. So it's not like the Monitor's base could have thousands upon thousands upon thousands of characters, because obviously someone has to animate that. That's someone's time, that's effort. And in a comic book, yes, you have deadlines, but you're working to what can the artist draw on the page. And so part of the joy of Crisis is the scale and scope of it and how it works on the page and how you're able to draw these absolutely wild panels that you just couldn't do in, for instance, live action. And some of that has to be rescaled for animation as well to make it work. And that is done perfectly. And to counterbalance that is this wonderful, emotional, human heart underneath it. And that comes in kind of three ways, really. At the forefront is the Flash and Iris. So Barry and Iris's relationship, which we see across multiple time periods. You also have a really surprising familial storyline for Bruce. You have the introduction of Dick Grayson, and then you have when, later in the film when things are starting to break down and things are really starting to become clear, you have the introduction of some other characters who are very important to him, but from a multiverse aspect, which adds a different element to his character, gives him something else to fight for. And then with Darren Criss as Superman, you call right back to Man of Tomorrow and his really wonderful relationship with Alexandra Daddario as Lois Lane, and that comes back into the fore. And so there are these wonderful human connections for each of the characters which really underpin all that huge scale action that's going on elsewhere in the film. And I really applaud that, because that feels very Tomorrowverse. The Tomorrowverse has had really wonderful relationships throughout every single film. you go back to Justice Society World War II and you look at the relationships that Wonder Woman had. You look at Man of Tomorrow and you see the relationship that Superman and Lois have. You look at Batman's kind of lack of connection in Long Halloween, really only having Alfred, and then you see how much he's impacted by having those relationships now. And it really ties it's so difficult to say it ties everything together nicely, because it both does and it doesn't, because there are still two more films to come, but you can feel how much all of the different elements are pulling through all of this series of films, and having all of those supporting characters. So you have the Green Lanterns, you have I was about to say John Stewart, that is Green Lantern, you have John Jones, you have all of these characters who you've met in different respects. And then when you add the multiverse factor, you get the Black Canary from Justice Society World War II. You have a different Aquaman and stuff in there. It's a really wonderful homage to all of the DC universe, as well as the Crisis storyline, as well as the stories that these filmmakers have created across this universe so far. And for that, I just massively applaud this film for doing everything basically perfectly. And the other thing that is really surprising, and there will be criticism of it online, because I'm sure there are people that feel like we've reached this point too early and that you shouldn't do this until 20 odd films down the line, but you do have to accelerate some of those relationships. So Dick Grayson really only has one scene before everything starts to fall apart, and you have to kind of just really suspend disbelief to understand the reactions that Bruce has to thinking that his world is going to end. But I've forgotten my point, which is terrible, isn't it? So there will be some criticism that it feels a bit like everything has been kicked into high gear and there's been some kind of fast forward to reach this point, but it just works. And so this is where Crisis really surprised me. I didn't really have any concerns going into it. I was excited to see what they would do, but there was a feeling of, I wonder how much I will care, not knowing if these characters would survive this film. For all we knew, we were going to come into chapter 1, and at the end of this first film, the Tomorrowverse Earth may have been wiped out, and we'd have spent the second film with one or two survivors working with the Monitor to try and figure out how to save other Earths, or everyone could have been wiped out and they'd have pulled the characters from the previous version of the universe, or who knows what they could have done. And there will be wild speculation, especially based on what the Arrowverse did with the Crisis on Infinite Earth storyline, as to who could pop up, what voices could pop up, what characters. If you've seen the teaser trailer for Chapter 2, then you'll know there is a very exciting character who has been added to the lineup. So not knowing where it was going to go, that was my only point where I thought, I wonder how this will be tackled and how I will react to how is it tackled. And so when I first watched the film and it reaches the point where the antimatter wave is headed towards Earth 1, which is the Tomorrowverse Earth, and our characters are basically resigned to their fate. You've already seen the crime syndicate, their Earth 3 being destroyed. And there's this moment where all of the characters that we've met in this film across this universe are essentially waiting for their death. They are doing nothing other than watching the wave come towards them. And the sense of, here's our other guest host for the day. Hello. The sense of anxiety and excitement and anticipation was really incredible, and it really surprised me. And I have watched the film a couple more times since then, and it is still a really exciting moment as they all just resign themselves to die. And I think that's incredible on the part of everyone involved with making the film, that they were able to take a bunch of animated characters who we've really only seen over the last sort of 2 to 3 years, really, when you think about it, and make us care about them to the point where we do not want them to be killed off by this antimatter wave, and we are worried for them as an audience when we think that might actually happen. And so that alone is why I ended up giving this film 5 stars in my review, because well done. I mean, you wouldn't have been able to get that kind of effect if we'd only had 1 or 2 films, but really in a short space of time they've created a wonderful set of characters with some really wonderful casting. Matt Bomer has such a human voice that he is perfect as Barry Allen. And you know, you only have to look at social media to see how much people celebrate Jensen Ackles and would love him to play a live action Batman, or how warmly people have come to love Darren Criss as Superman. Meg Donnelly, if rumor is to be believed, then Meg Donnelly is testing to potentially be our live action Supergirl in James Gunn's DCU, which is incredible. Again, she's only been in 2 films. And so it's just, yeah, the writing is impeccable, and I really, really applaud that across the board. I think there is a way this film could have ended which may have been a little bit more exciting. However, I really appreciate where this film ends leading into part 2. It needed to reach a point where you could kind of close off a chapter and leave us wondering what would happen next. I wondered whether the film would leave us on a sense of not knowing the fates of our characters. And so on first watch, I did wonder how far it would go beyond that once it does reach beyond that point. And there's a little push and pull in me between there was a really sort of jaw-dropping ending where I would be sat here going, oh my god, I don't know what's happened. What is happening? I can't wait. Whereas instead it's more narratively fulfilling. So you could watch chapter 1, you will be fulfilled by chapter 1 and have plenty of questions for going into chapter 2. So I think it works. I think it works really well. In terms of the animation, and I could go on about this for a very long time because we've talked about it before, and how Otto Schmidt is the kind of the inspiration between some of the design work here with the kind of thicker line work and the more flat sounds bad, but I don't mean it in a critical way, kind of colouring of the characters and the world that they inhabit. But I think this is the best we've ever seen this animation style look. And I know we've talked about it in some of the previous interviews, how from Man of Tomorrow onwards they've made small tweaks to just kind of improve and work on the overall style, much as they did with the previous set of films, which had a more 2D, more almost sort of Eastern anime inspiration to them. But it looks so great. It's so dynamic. It works really well with the idea of Crisis. And so I think this is probably the best looking of these films as well. I feel like it's really stepped up, even from last year's Warworld, to the point where we reach this big multiversal story. And I think it looks really great on screen. And that's important because when you've got multiple Supermen, let's not say too many, when you've got multiples of characters, it's important that you're able to kind of delineate between who is who, and you need those visual cues. So the animation style is really heavily relied upon to be able to do that, and it works perfectly. I'm slightly worried I'm going to get into spoiler territory if I say too much more. What else do I want to say? Oh yeah, I do want to say a little bit more about Iris and Barry, just because it's such a wonderful, wonderful storyline between them. I think it was a really nice idea to shift Barry into a more central focus. It works in terms of the Tomorrowverse, but it also works well for this adaptation of the story. And having Matt Bomer and that, as I just said, his really human voice at the core of it works so well, because you do feel like Barry is carrying the weight of the multiverse on his shoulders. He has seen some really terrible things across this film. And then Iris, not referred to as his lightning bolt, though it felt like that was something I should have said. Having her with him and seeing, kind of going back to when they first connected, seeing their wedding and seeing a future version of them kind of really futilely fighting to save the multiverse, or to at least save their Earth and their relationship and each other, is really, really cool to see, and I think was a really neat way of tying everything together in terms of the storyline. And it'll be interesting to see how that might work in future parts as well, whether the focus will shift a little bit as the story grows and changes towards its conclusion, or how much Barry will end up being the focus of the whole trilogy. So that's really exciting to see moving into the future parts. Now then, there is another thing that I want to talk about, and this was something that I really did want to mention in my interview, but I just didn't have time. If you have sat through the end credits of this film, if you watch this film and there was a character whose voice stuck out to you particularly, and then you got to the end credits and you wondered why a name was missing, or there might be some misdirection, this is something I want to touch on. So in the comics, there is a character called Pariah, in the Arrowverse, if you haven't read the comic but you've watched the Arrowverse version, this was a role that Tom Cavanagh's character took on. Now, Pariah in the comic is someone who is on every Earth as it dies. He is kind of being pulled around the multiverse, and he's kind of doomed to watch each of the Earths die. It's his kind of punishment for things that he has done. And there is a character referred to only in the credits of this film as Homeless Man, who you meet on each of the Earths. Him and Barry come into contact with each other a few times, and he isn't called Pariah, he is just Homeless Man, and he's credited in the end credits to Nolan North, the wonderful, wonderful Nolan North, who also voices Hal Jordan and Amazo. But I call bull on that, because he sounds very, very, very much like Matt Ryan to me. Now, I didn't ask about it in my interview, so I don't know. This is not me confirming anything. This is my kind of theorizing. It sounds like Matt Ryan to me. And his character at one point in the film, kind of echoing the idea of Pariah, talks about having to watch these Earths die as his punishment for something that he, and potentially he and Flash, has done in the past. Now, that echoes some of Constantine's dialogue from Constantine House of Mystery, the wonderful short from a couple of years ago, I think, when we pick up with Matt Ryan's Constantine living in the House of Mystery and in sort of in limbo after the end of the previous universe, and that he is kind of doomed to just float around without a home, without a place, because his universe was brought to an end. Now, if you flash back to Justice League Dark Apocalypse War, how did that universe come to an end? That universe came to an end when they had been absolutely devastated by Darkseid and Apocalypse. Heroes were dead, people had been irreversibly changed by their experiences, and as all of the remaining heroes, dead, dying, alive, were on that rock at the end, it was Constantine, Matt Ryan's Constantine, who ignited the idea in Flash to run so hard that he would reset the universe. So I wonder whether Homeless Man, not voiced by Nolan North, but potentially voiced by Matt Ryan, is really Matt Ryan's Constantine, and that he, from connecting the world from those previous series of movies into House of Mystery, into the Tomorrowverse, is paying for what he did with the Flash, and that is also why Flash is now a central part and is travelling between these Earths and seeing things come to an end. I do not know. That is not something that's hinted at in any of the teaser for part 2. I don't have any inside information, but that is my 2 cents on it from what I have seen. I think there is a connection here between what happened in the previous universe into this universe, the actions of those characters, and what that means as a kind of ramification for the DC animated franchise as a whole, right the way back to Superman, Doomsday, and Gotham Knight, the anthology. All of those movies from there up to this point, I think, have potentially got some kind of connection here. So that's very exciting. And I'm interested to see where that goes. What I also love, just to wrap it up, is the fact... So again, if you think about the Arrowverse version of Crisis, each of those episodes started with flashes and cameos of different people. You know, you saw Burt Ward, you saw Ashley Scott, you saw characters from Batman 89, you saw characters from all over the place. Titans, Doom Patrol. And that was a wonderful way to celebrate all of DC on TV and pull in some of film. Obviously, in the Flash movie, you saw Christopher Reeve, you saw, Superman and Supergirl, you saw Adam West Batman. That also celebrated some of the DCU across multimedia. I really appreciate that this film hasn't just gone straight into some sort of complete cameo smorgasbord. So there are lots of people who you could theorise. I mean, wouldn't it be lovely if it turned out that Kevin Conroy had recorded some dialogue before he sadly passed away? There are loads of what-ifs, questions that we could ask about this, but I appreciate that this film hasn't just become that, and that this isn't a case of kind of the greatest hits of DC animation. It could become that in parts 2 and 3, and it could be well earned when it does. But I like that that's not the sole intention of this film. And again, I applaud the writers and the creators for that. And I think that is a good place to finish it. So if you want to read my full review, then it is up on the website, www.getyourcomiccon.co.uk. You can read it now. I gave this film 5 stars. If you want to watch the interview again, it's also going to be up on our YouTube channel as well as in this podcast. If you've not watched the film, please do go grab it. You can pick it up on digital platforms now. And as I have said already a couple of times in this podcast, it comes to 4K UHD Blu-ray Steelbook on January the 29th, 2024. If you're listening to this after the fact, I hope you have grabbed your copy. I hope you loved it. I want to know what you think about it as well. So please do reach out and let me know. You can find me on social media. I am at Neil Varg on all major platforms. You can, of course, follow us on all platforms as at Get Your Comic Con. We recently, as I talked about in the previous podcast, we recently joined TikTok and we're trying to figure out how that world works. So if you use it, please do follow us and help us figure out what meaningful content we can bring to you on there. And that leaves me with one final fun job. We have a copy of Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 1 on 4K UHD Blu-ray Steelbook to give away. So, simply, to win, all you have to do is follow us on Twitter. Retweet the tweet of this podcast and use hashtag Geico Crisis. That is GYCO Crisis. CRISIS. I hope I spelled that right. Follow and retweet, basically, and you can be in with a chance of winning a copy of the film on disc, and that is currently only open to UK entrants because we're working with Warner Brothers UK on it, and it's to promote the film's UK release. And so that leaves me with just to say goodbye. Thank you for sticking with us. I'm sorry that we took a little break in December, but we are back. There will be obviously more podcasts in 2024, and I will hopefully be joined by James and some of the rest of the team so that it's not just you having to listen to my voice over and over again. We got some really fun stuff coming up. I took January very, very slowly. Crisis is the only film that I have worked on so far this year. I've got a really interesting Apple TV series called Constellation starring Noomi Rapace to talk about with you very, very soon. Currently under embargo. I am also in the next few days going to be watching Argylle, a new Matthew Vaughn film which stars Henry Cavill, Dua Lipa, Bryce Dallas Howard, Catherine O'Hara, Sam Rockwell. That's everyone. All the usual Matthew Vaughn people are in there, as well as some really cool other characters. I haven't seen it yet, going to be seeing it the next few days, so we'll be talking about that in a future podcast as well. And plenty more comic book content to come as well. We have also booked our flights and our hotel for San Diego Comic Con this year, so yes, Geico Does Comic Con is happening again, so really looking forward to that. Got lots of plans to make before July this year. We'll probably talk lots more about that in the future. So until next time, thanks for tuning in, stay safe, stay well, and I'll see you out there. Bye!